Because a young man with complicated politics killed right-wing influencer and political operative Charlie Kirk, the Trump administration is going to use that as pretext to go after media outlets, advocacy organizations, NGOs, and academia. FBI Director Kash Patel said as much today in a Senate hearing. He said a lot, actually, about Epstein and a lot of other things, but there was one thing that he said in regards to who he and the FBI and the Trump administration are going to go after to punish for Charlie Kirk's death, even though one guy was responsible. That caught my attention.
So we work with our partners at the Treasury Department to trace where the money came from, how these individuals paid for the training they received or the platforms they were using, and also how these individuals collectively got together in whatever groups they were on whatever social media sites they were on, to utilize clickbait to make money for their ideology.
Patel said he's going to use the investigative powers of the FBI and the federal government to go after organizations that produce, quote, clickbait that they then profit off of. I took that to mean the media, but really what it probably actually means is any entity or organization or person that produces some form of content that the Trump administration and Republicans simply disagree with. Here's Patel.
So in terms of how we crack down on the root cause of this violence, for now putting aside the ideological motivations and how they got there, the monetary issue is a real issue, and as I've said before, we follow the money. So to trace all of those, we are using, not just in Charlie's investigation, but others, lawful process and serving 2703D orders on any entity that is related in any way financially to any of these criminal acts of violence, and we are going to hold them accountable with our partners at the Department of Justice.
Now, if you don't think this matters because you're not a journalist, or maybe you never post anything online, which seems implausible these days, but to give you an example of what this could possibly look like, the Brennan Center, which is one of these organizations that Republicans will probably say is a liberal advocacy group or something like that, they got their hands on documents from inside the Department of Homeland Security that revealed a huge fuck up inside the agency in which intelligence data was exposed to thousands of people that should never have had access to it. That potentially is the exact kind of clickbait that Patel and others are going to use as pretext to investigate media outlets and other organizations. Specifically, Patel said that he would utilize Section 2703D of U.S. Code to get warrants and court orders that will allow him to force organizations and entities to hand over internal communications so that his FBI agents can probe through them for evidence of criminal wrongdoing. Now, obviously, this is all in response to the assassination of Kirk, which was carried out by a young man whose politics at this point are pretty confusing, complicated, to use another word. But the American right has simply decided that the killer of Kirk was a left-wing radical. They're using that narrative to do all sorts of things that if a Democrat were in the White House, they would decry as abuses of power. There's a similarity here to what happened following the attacks on September 11, 2001, when Democrats and Republicans united and gave unprecedented power to the executive branch, which led to the expansion of the surveillance state that allowed agencies like the NSA to spy on Americans. One of the biggest things to come out of that was the Patriot Act. And we're seeing a similar but slightly different variation of that here. Primarily in that there are no Democrats calling for an expansion of the surveillance state and more power for the Trump White House to be able to go after its political enemies simply because a right-wing political operative and extremely popular voice was just assassinated. Senator Eric Schmitt of Missouri in today's hearing provided a little bit of insight into the backstory of where all this is coming from, because this did not just start with the killing of Charlie Kirk. Schmitt, like a lot of Republicans, seems to truly believe that there is a vast left-wing conspiracy of NGOs, advocacy organizations, and media outlets who are funding or otherwise directly supporting street-level violence. In his remarks, Schmitt mentioned a debunked conspiracy about pallets of bricks being left around in American cities during the unrest that followed the killing of George Floyd in the summer of 2020.
The George Soros empire has financed a vast ecosystem of radicals, all working together, dropping off bricks at riots. to unleash a tidal wave of violently anarchists on our streets and to prop it up in an army of researchers and experts and journalists and propagandists who downplay the political violence.
The idea that left-wing violence is somehow being funded by liberal advocacy groups and people like George Soros is not an uncommon one on the American right. Kirk himself was a big fan of pushing the theory that Jews are behind the scenes orchestrating, funding, and supporting U.S. political violence.
And Jews have been some of the largest funders of cultural Marxist ideas and supporters of those ideas over the last 30 or 40 years. Because Jewish donors have been the number one funding mechanism of radical, open border, neoliberal, quasi-Marxist policies, cultural institutions, and nonprofits. This is a beast created by secular Jews.
Since Kirk's death, Republicans have swiftly aligned calling for these investigations into liberal groups, using very similar and sometimes identical language. Here's Ted Cruz at today's Senate hearing.
The violence we are seeing is not purely organic. There is, I believe, significant money that is spreading dissension, that is spreading violence.
Now wait, where else did I hear that phrase today?
The violence we are seeing is not purely organic.
If all this weren't enough, the vice president took some time out of being the second most powerful person in the world to host an episode of Charlie Kirk's podcast for several hours at the White House the other day. One of the people he talked to was White House advisor Stephen Miller. Here's Miller saying, as he has been for days, that the power of the state needs to be marshaled in order to go after liberal groups, probably the press and people like George Soros.
Which is that we need to have an organized strategy to go after the left-wing organizations that are promoting violence in this country. And I will write those words onto my heart and I will carry them out.
In the same podcast, Vance took quite a bit of time to complain about an article in The Nation that simply pointed out Kirk's own words, making sure to note that The Nation receives some funding from George Soros.
I read a story in The Nation magazine about my dear friend, Charlie Kirk. Now, The Nation isn't a fringe blog. It's a well-funded, well-respected magazine whose publishing history goes back to the American Civil War. George Soros' Open Society Foundation funds this magazine.
In that same breathless rant, here's Vance apparently saying that people who fund publications like The Nation and anyone else who writes unfavorably about Kirk are terrorist sympathizers.
There is no unity with the people who celebrate Charlie Kirk's assassination. And there is no unity with the people who fund these articles, who pay the salaries of these terrorist sympathizers, who argue that Charlie Kirk, a loving husband and father, deserved a shot to the neck.
So if the White House, the FBI, and Republicans and Congress are super gung-ho about investigating Americans for what a lot of times amounts to protected free speech, what else are they willing to do?